firstly, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Really excited to be hosting everyone on the second edition of our Spatial Insider webinar series. I'm Gaurav, I'm the host, I'm the co-founder of NextBillion.ai. And in this webinar series, what we hope to bring is some of the world's leading geospatial industry experts, and where the intent is to not just showcase the fact that spatial tech, location tech is a really cool piece of technology to work on, but also that it drives millions and billions of dollars in commercial impact. Uh, and with that said, I'm super excited to be hosting our second guest on this webinar series, Kim. Kim Fennell uh, he's had an amazing career. He's been CEO of multiple companies, the last one of which was deCarta, which was a landmark company, by all accounts in maps. He's an angel investor in multiple companies. He's a board member, led large teams, worked across multiple continents. So, Kim, thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited to be having you here on our webinar series.
Great. Hey, thanks, Gaurav. I appreciate the invitation. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So maybe to kick things off, Kim. We obviously, I started off a little bit about your background, but maybe in your own words for everyone in the audience, would love to, maybe for you to share a little bit about your background. I know you've done a whole wide variety of things in your career, but maybe that's a way for us to just, get this thing started.
Sure. Well, your intro made me sound much cooler than I really am, but thanks for that. And yeah, quick background is I'm from Canada originally, so judge all my comments accordingly. But I grew up in the Toronto area and started working up there. But I've always worked for Silicon Valley-based companies. And I'll date myself here by saying I was very fortunate to work for some of the very early iconic companies in the Valley in the 80s and the 90s, such as Rollum and Octal, which no one's ever heard of anymore. But I had the good fortune to work in a lot of different industries, from mainframe computers to telecom to data storage, broadcast media, and then mapping, which was an opportunity to really kind of merge telecom and maps. And I was fortunate to get some international experience along the way. I lived in Europe for 6 years, ran Europe and then international for a Valley company. And I've always had a preference really for startups, even though when we got acquired by a larger company, I kind of went back and did startups. But I should let folks know that I'm unlike you and others who do startups. I'm not smart enough to have ever started a company. I've always gone in as the second CEO to scale it up, and that kind of seems to be where my focus has been. And yeah, the last one.
And maybe that's a great segue to the next question, which is obviously deCarta. We're here on spatial. We're talking about geospatial tech, and deCarta was, by all accounts, a pretty landmark company and sort of category defining company, so to say. Would love for you to share, tell us more about the history of that company. What kind of products were you selling, and how did sort of some of the landscape evolve over the years?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the thing about deCarta is it was actually got started very early. Actually, its earlier name was called Telcontar, and I changed the name of the company when I came in for what I think are obvious reasons. No one could ever pronounce it, but it got started at a time when the U.S. government said, "Hey, now you can use the GPS satellites." People said, "Hey, that's great. Let's start a mapping company. Let's leverage that for doing navigation." But it was very, very early on. It was like even before there were GPS chipsets in cell phones. But to kind of maybe explain where it fit in the food chain, and really kind of maybe to help as we talk about this throughout the seminar, I like to describe the industry as really having three main components. You've got data. I mean, folks like here and TomTom that are doing pure data. You've got platform companies that do all the software for the routing, the navigation, the search, et cetera. And then you've got applications that sit on top. deCarta was in that middle section. We were a pure platform play. We were not a brand. We leveraged third-party data. But in fact, most of the leading navigation apps in the early days. Anyway, but we had a nice early run, including people like Google. My shameless name dropping story here is in 2004, Larry Page came to visit us and said, "Hey, we're going to launch Google Maps next year in 2005. We don't know anything about mapping." So we're going to use your platform. We did all the routing and navigation. I kind of wish I'd always recorded that or videotaped that site. But, and then of course 3 years later they developed their own platform and went on their own way. But and then and then they turned around and gave it away for free, which kind of really disrupted the marketplace. And we shifted into some other markets, but those were a different time.
So while we continue on the webinar, for everyone in the audience, we'll be taking live questions through the course of the webinar, and not just at the end. So yeah, please feel free to sort of add in your questions, and then we'll pick them up sort of as the webinar goes. So moving on, Kim. So that's very helpful context about deCarta. So and I know later on it was acquired by Uber, obviously another landmark company of our generation. So what was so compelling to Uber about deCarta, and then what is it that was interesting to you about working with Uber, for example?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think that the move behind that is, I think, very symptomatic of some of the shifts and things we're seeing in the marketplace today. I mean, for us as a company, we'd moved along very well. We had a lot of good customers and good partners. But by late 2014, we were getting a lot of inbound interest from some companies in terms of M&A. So I reached out to Uber because I looked at them and thought, they were still relatively small at the time, by the way, just 3,000 people. But my view was that, look, the map's critical to their business. They have a very high dependency on Google, who's obviously very good, but it could be an existential threat. As I like to say, no map, no business. Costs could get high, but I really felt that they would want to ultimately customize the look and feel, not only of the map, but how they routed people, how they used the software tools for navigation. So that was the pitch. And it was right at a time where they were starting to think about that. I felt that they could use better local search and that, that technology. So, that's why it was appealing to them. And that's why they acquired the company in March of 2015.
Yeah, and I mean, I think 2015 to, the next 3-4 years, especially, seems like, one of the most golden periods in Uber's era, where it went through just this massive growth cycle. So you obviously decided to hang around post the acquisition. It seems during that phase, Uber also invested massively in maps. There were also some interesting stories, I guess, going back to the same Larry Page thing. I know there was, this huge thing about Larry Page and Travis and not sort of getting along and feeling, all kinds of things about, hey, you stole my ambition and you stole my dreams. But yeah, would love to, could you share a little bit about your time at Uber, and then, how did sort of the map strategy evolve and your role evolve there over time?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, well, so obviously in acquiring the company, the decision was to do some of the things, on our own. I actually wasn't originally supposed to stay. They wanted the technology, they wanted the engineers, but they didn't want the customer base. They didn't want to be in the maps business. But they asked me to stick around for a year and wind the business down, and we moved our customers over, in fact, to TomTom. But then after doing that, they actually said, well, would you be interested in staying and help out in terms of helping us develop the map strategy and doing the business development for it? So that was an interesting opportunity. But then I'd, of course, had a chance to see the place. It was a fascinating place. And I thought, hey, this could be a cool place to hang for a while. So I decided to stay, and I had the opportunity to work with some other, wonderful people at the company in creating the Uber map strategy. Along the way, we recruited a lot of people out of, for instance, Google. We brought over Brian McLennan, who was really kind of the father of Google Maps from the Keyhole days, Manik Gupta, who had been running Google Maps from a product point of view. And we brought in a lot of folks there on the engineering side. And then what my team did is we built up a business development team, and we did partnerships with almost 100 different data companies and partners in the industry. So, the short version of 5 years on it would have been, we set out to maybe do a lot of things on our own, leveraging third-party data. In parallel with that, we also worked on the Google relationship, and my team, worked on that and kind of renegotiated those terms so that it was less of an existential threat. So it was kind of a balance between those those two different things. Of course, then 2017 happened. Our year of living, shall we say, dangerously at Uber. A lot of changes. Some people came in, some people came out. I ended up taking over and running business development for US and Canada. I maintained the Maps team as one of my teams, but we kind of adjusted the map strategy. There's only so much I can say about that, but maybe rather than doing everything, we realized there were some important things that we could do and should do that would be unique to our business model and what we really needed. And yet, on the other time, we could leverage other software, and including Google. So where that made sense. So it was really kind of a hybrid model, which it is today. We did end up repairing the relationship with Google and renegotiated those terms. So we have a long-term relationship there. That's public information. And then I left at the end of 2019. It'd been 5 wonderful years. The company was 27,000 people by then, and I just thought, okay, it's time to move on to this chapter. So I'm doing a lot of angel investing and board work.
Yeah, awesome. And I think you touched upon a whole bunch of very interesting elements, and we're starting to see some questions come in as well, where people are asking about how sort of the landscape evolved, and companies are no longer relying on just data for better maps. So you touched upon Google, you touched upon existential threats, uniquenesses, and I would love to sort of go back to some of those, but maybe it's a good segue to sort of drawing a line from the past to the future, and maybe shifting focus to talking about some industry trends. So obviously, deCarta, I guess, it seems you powered the thing early on for Google Maps, but obviously now Google is a dominant player in the industry, and maybe you could say deCarta was an early alternative to Google that way. But it seems like there is a trend right now of people or companies looking for alternatives to Google Maps. And why do you think that's happening, and what segments is it happening in, and if it's your sense of why is it happening?
Yeah, well, and first of all, I want to be really clear. Google has done an amazing job. I mean, Google Maps, we use it. Everybody, uses it. It's a great consumer map tool. They've invested billions and billions of dollars, and frankly done a wonderful job. And I use it for routing quite regularly. But you're right. There's notwithstanding that, there's an accelerating trend that I'm seeing now, much more so than we were when we were trying to do it, for companies to do their own thing, separate from Google. And there's really kind of 3 drivers for that. One, yes, and everyone's aware, there's Google raised their prices substantially. Some people say 3x, whatever, but it's a big change a couple of years ago. But that's really only one factor. In some cases, the factor is kind of that existential threat. If you're a large company, how dependent do you want to be on any one supplier? In this case, Google Maps. The third, and I think the most important one, is this increasing desire for more product flexibility to do more unique things with a custom map or routing or search. And there, of course, part of that is, Google has somewhat, some people would say, some restrictive terms of service. And the more you try to do, you're finding you're kind of bumping into those things, which is a little bit ironic, because I remember back in the day, my data suppliers at the time used to complain about how Google was violating terms of service with that. So, what goes around comes around, I suppose. But those are the 3 big reasons why I'm seeing this, in particular, the product flexibility.
And a lot of our audience, so this is really interesting, right? Like, because a lot of our audience come from, for example, companies that rely very heavily on maps in one way or another. So, would love for you to touch, or maybe spend a little bit more time talking about each of these things in more details. You mentioned pricing, you mentioned like existential threat, the desire to do unique and sort of flexible things.
Sure.
So would love to hear more about, how companies could think about this, and also, obviously the Google Maps price hike itself was a pretty hotly, talked about thing in the industry. So, with all this big tech, antitrust and whatnot going on as well, would love to hear your thoughts. Why would they do this in this climate? And, when they actually had almost sort of a near monopoly position. So would love for you to touch upon some of these things more.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of what I've heard, what I understand from, first of all, let's be clear, the mapping industry is a very small industry. It's still a small industry. A lot of people know each other. And so, word travels pretty easily throughout it. But, I'd say internally at Google, I think there was some pressure for them to frankly pay their own way. I mean, they were investing between $1 billion and $1.5 billion a year on maps. It's a lot of money that we've all benefited from, but perhaps it wasn't, it was existing based on the fact that advertising revenues and other parts of the business were supporting that. And that was always a bit of a problem to some of us in the industry, but we never did anything about that. I think there's internal pressure there, but there is, secondly, and this is public information, or at least has been written about, I think there's some internal concern there about the US and European regulators looking closer at them to make sure that there's not anti-competitive behavior going on. So I think there's an increasing desire for them to show that it's self-sufficient on its own. And then the third thing you're seeing is that, that complicated for some people is they've modified their pricing models. They've changed it. Not everything's like a per transaction model that it was for many, many years. They've tuned it to different business models, which to some degree makes sense. So if you're in the on-demand business or the delivery business, they've modified their pricing to be, they want a per trip pricing. But the key issue here that's been a driver, I think, for people wanting to make changes, there's this model where it says you've got to take the whole stack. If you say go on the per trip model with Google, you can't say I just want search, or I just want routing. You've got to kind of take everything, and that inhibits some companies from having the flexibility they may want to mix and match in terms of capabilities and data. For instance, you still can't use Google search results on your own map, on a third-party map. So some people are finding that to be a little bit inflexible.
Yeah,
go ahead. Well, I was going to get into, then you got the dependency factor. Some of the larger companies don't want to be. I've kind of covered that with Uber, but same thing. Apple, a while ago, obviously back in 2013, famously decided to do its own maps. Did not have a good start. They have a hard time getting away from that reputation. And I think that was just, I know it was just an oversight or an underestimation of how hard this is to do. They can't just throw a few smart engineers at it and suddenly create mapping. To be fair to them, though, they've invested a lot of money. I know the team there, and Apple Maps are substantially better than they used to, but they're spending, probably billions of dollars to do that whole thing. Amazon's looked at it and tried to do the same thing. So there are very, very few companies that can kind of build that whole stack and do this on it. Because keep in mind, it's hard to do. It's hard to do really, really well. So I don't think there's a lot of people that are going to do that whole stack, and they don't have to anymore. And I think that's kind of the key message, is that there's now so many different companies now that are increasingly doing sections of that ecosystem, whether it's routing or whether it's just data or whether, say map tiling or just geocoding. And you can leverage a lot of those to enable you to have the kind of flexibility you want for your own application. So, I mean, maybe just one more point on that is just, if you're let's say you're in the hotel industry and you're Hilton Hotels, and you want, because the companies are increasingly looking for things via a map. Well, okay, if you're Hilton, you want people looking at a map that's a Hilton map with showing Hilton hotels. You don't want to see Marriott hotels beside it, okay? And so Google's not going to give you that. You've got to, you want that degree of flexibility. And so I think, getting a little deeper, we're increasingly seeing companies recognize that they can differentiate themselves and get some competitive advantage if they leverage various tools in mapping or search along the way. I'll give you one quick example, and I'll shut up on this area. But I probably used this example for years when I was at Uber. But if you're in the meal delivery business, you're DoorDash or Uber Eats or Grubhub or whatever. I mean, wouldn't it be kind of cool if you have the back door of a restaurant that backs onto an alleyway? Well, wouldn't it be neat if you could say, okay, I want to create that as a unique POI so that DoorDash or whoever can route people, to that back door, the drivers to the back door, so that they can get much faster pickup rather than having to park the car down the road and waste 5 or 10 minutes. On the other hand, you don't want that back door of the restaurant showing up on a Google Maps for the public to get access to it. Nor, if you're DoorDash, do you want Uber Eats or Grubhub to know about it as well. You want to use that as a unique advantage for you. So that's the kind of things where companies can create unique advantages. In this case, time. But to do that, you need to have that flexibility to create your own POIs, but overlay it, say, on a common map.
Yeah, and I think you touched upon a bunch of points about competitive advantage, differentiation, leveraging your own data. So I would love to come back to this, but maybe this is a good time to take a couple of audience questions that have come up on some of these topics. So, for example, let's take this question, which is very related to the point you just mentioned about DoorDash trying to use its own data. So, the question here is, historically, a lot of companies have relied on data, or having the best data, and having the best data equates to having best maps. But you seem to be making like a sort of a very different point here, right? Which is, you're saying, if I am DoorDash or I'm Grubhub, I should leverage not just some other data, but really the advantage is, can I leverage my own data to create some unique competitive advantages? So, what's your thought on this shifting landscape? And do you think this trend is sort of here to stay, or would love your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I think you're hitting on a good point where people recognize, wait a minute, they have unique data. They're capturing unique data through the application, or say through trip data or what have you. And how do they leverage their own data, their own information? Or maybe they want to source and go find unique data and leverage that for their own advantage. But they have to have a way to incorporate that into, say, a routing application, so that you kind of get the full use case done. There's no point just getting great data if you can't do anything with it. So, an example here would be, and I know this is areas that you guys are involved in, is if DoorDash can collect its own trip data, for instance, and if it's driving from point A to point B, from this restaurant to this condominium complex, for example, that's 5 miles away, and it's done that route, or it's tried to do that route hundreds and hundreds of times. Well, wouldn't it be smart to capture all that and then apply some machine learning to that, which is what you guys are doing, and then feed that back to DoorDash so that next time that that requirement is there to get from that point A to point B, you've got an optimized route. Okay, you've tried so many different options, and your local knowledge has come into it because drivers know the areas better than a general mapping company is going to do it. And so you can leverage that and provide that unique optimized route back to DoorDash. And in that case, and if that saves them 2 minutes versus somebody else, or 5 minutes versus somebody else, that creates a competitive advantage. It's a silly little example, but it's a real example, and that's what companies are trying to do, because you start magnifying that by thousands and thousands and thousands and maybe millions of routes, and it makes a difference.
Yeah, and we bring up this different example. It's a slightly older example, but still a very famous one, right? Like UPS trucks don't turn left. That's a very famous example. Like in our context, not talking about our product, but that's an example we give our customers a lot, which is what you need is not the route Google Maps is giving you, but you need the UPS trucks don't turn left route for your use case. And the best way to do that is probably your data. So maybe we take another question, and you already touched upon this topic a little bit, which is Apple, right? So Apple, a lot of us, UChem obviously have been very close, closely involved, seeing the landscape evolve. And obviously, when Apple Maps launched, it didn't really go that well, to put it politely. So, what's your thought on Apple's strategy over the years of using OSM, using TomTom, now trying to do some of its own thing, spending billions of dollars upon it, and then and maybe what's useful is the thought process and some of the lessons which maybe other companies here in the audience could take.
Yeah, because there's the early problem, and how it was remediated, how it was fixed, and the early problem. And by the way, I still see this today. I mean, friends of mine in the industry, we kind of shake our head every once in a while when we hear about another company saying, "Oh yeah, I'm just going to do this on my own." And I'm, telling old war stories here. I remember the same thing that happened at Apple. I mean, the point being that they applied a few engineers to it, more than a few, but it came out in 2013 and it completely fell on its face, and it just wasn't very good. And the key point behind it is that it's not just about smart engineers, it's also about experience and knowledge and understanding the corner cases. I mean, there's no such thing as, you're never getting like a million perfect routes. There's always going to be some flaws. I mean, I remember telling this to Travis after they acquired deCarta. He said, "Hey, great. Well, we're gonna build our own maps and we want to get going." I said, "Well, great. So I just want to let you know that you can throw a few engineers at this, and you can get building a mapping system is frankly very easy. You can get to 80% accuracy pretty quickly. But to get to 99% accuracy, it's going to take years and years and years and many, many, many engineers. And you're never going to get to 100%. And you're going to have to be patient." And Travis didn't like being told to be patient, mind you, by the way. But I continue to see that situation occur with companies. They'll say, "Hell yeah, maybe it's time for us to move up. We'll just go do this ourselves." It's a lot harder. Now, the good news is there's many, many better tools out there to use now, and companies do it, and we can talk about that. But to give Apple some credit, they learned from that early mistake. They've invested. I mean, there are thousands of people working there now. That team, Max Muller, and that whole organization, they've really doubled down. Some of my old friends from deCarta are there. And they've taken a different approach where some companies choose to say, "Hey," even including Google, I want to own this data, or I want to own this. Apple's approach is no. They don't want to be a mapping company to sell maps. They just want to have the best maps they can for that iPhone. And so they've invested money not only in collecting their own data, but using OSM. When it comes to things like POIs and whatnot, they don't have an interest in owning it. They license as many good POI data suppliers as they can get. They beat the crap out of them, and in the sense of, "Hey, we want you to do, improve your quality," which is a good thing. And they give them that feedback, and they're very, very good at that. But as a result of that, they'll license as much good data as they can, but they don't feel the need to own it. They're really just trying to create a very good map and do it the best way they can. So I want to give them some credit, some props there.
Yeah, and actually, I think you've already made through quite a few examples, like fairly compelling arguments, right? That if your business depends heavily on location, and if it's a potential competitive differentiation, if it helps you save 2 minutes off of millions and millions of orders or trips, you definitely should consider doing something yourself right now. You've also made the argument now that, hey, you know what, this is actually much harder than it looks. And you probably should not try to do everything yourself, right? So, I mean, that sort of naturally begs the question, and that there's already a question actually here in the audience, which is, I'll get back to the question after, but where should enterprises draw the line, and how do you know where to draw the line? Because you've already said, hey, it's good to do something yourself, but you've also said, hey, you know what, you should not try to do everything yourself. So how do you draw the line? And then maybe just to go through the specific question here as well. So the question is, hi Kim, thanks for mentioning the Google Maps pricing model. From an enterprise organization point of view, how do you suggest coping with this model other than building everything, the whole stack from scratch, from OSM or other data sources?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think it's kind of in line with what we've been talking about here. Is okay. Due to the reasons we've talked about in terms of possibly seeking alternatives to Google from a restriction point of view and wanting the flexibility to do anything, then the question becomes, okay, how much of that do you do on your own? And I think I already made the point that there's only a very few companies like an Apple or maybe an Amazon or some large players that should or could do the entire thing, but you don't need to, because there are so many companies, whether it's a NextBillion or a Mapbox or, there's a RideOS, there's lots of good companies out there that can help with some of these things, and data suppliers. So here's the key point. think about what you truly need that's unique and build that. Don't rebuild or duplicate efforts of things that aren't going to provide any differentiation. The management consultants would call that core versus context. Focus on the things which are core to you that are unique to you. If it's just context, meaning it's not a differentiator, then leverage a third party. And so I'll give you a good example, and you could use OSM. My usual comment is, we don't need 12 companies to go map Market Street in San Francisco. Everybody knows what Market Street is. You're not going to differentiate your company by having a slightly better looking map of Market Street, okay? So if OSM or a third-party map data provider has got a nice view and road network data for Market Street, for Christ's sake, use that, all right? Focus instead on the data that's unique to you, like we talked about earlier, maybe unique trip routes or things like that, or are there unique POIs or data sets that would be helpful to your business that will allow you to be competitive in your space and leverage the third-party stuff. And so that's why, I'm a big proponent of OSM, because it can help with some of those common things. It has its challenges. I don't know if that's a good place for me to shift to maybe talk a little bit about OSM. Up to you, Gaurav.
Yeah, so I think that was actually going to be exactly my next question. But before we get there, I think you made a very good point, right? Which is companies should think about. So it's almost like saying, hey, you know what? There is Google and whatever else, off the shelf. And then there's this other extreme path about trying to build everything yourself. But then there's sort of this intermediate path where you can build it yourself, but use others to build it for your, to build it yourself, and only focus on, core versus context and the key differentiators. So yeah, exactly. The point that you just made, which is, would love your thoughts on, OSM, but also not just OSM, which is, what do you feel about the other, big data providers in this space, right? Like here, TomTom. They're obviously the more traditional mapping companies existed, way before, Google Maps was around. So would love your thoughts on, what does some of this mean for those companies? And yeah, obviously OSM is an increasingly popular topic. So would love your thoughts on OSM here, TomTom.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the short answer, and I'll come and fill it in, is, look, I've worked with TeleAtlas and then TomTom for many, many years. Here, which used to be called Navtech, worked with them for many, many years. Great companies, done a great job in investing in building maps, but they've got great data in many areas, but they don't have great data everywhere, okay, and for every data set. And it's just a very expensive and a difficult thing for them to do. And so I think increasingly you're seeing them, I think they should augment things and then collaborate with OSM. And that may, for many years, that was kind of like, no, that's just never going to happen. I mean, that was just too far afield. But I think those days are coming. With respect to OSM, look, I've been a supporter of that since Steve Coast, launched it in 2005 and got things going. It was a great concept, great idea. It was kind of like the Wikipedia of maps. But the problem was it didn't have as many people contributing. You just don't have enough map geeks all over the world, in every city, in every town, in every village, to want to walk around it and create the best maps. So for any particular country, you may have great data in a big part of it, but because it's not completely covered, you still need some third-party data in many cases. So it's great, but it's not consistent. I think the other challenges have been maybe a little bit of the kind of the license restriction aspects to it and how they want to operate. I mean, it's very much a volunteer organization, which I give it huge props for. You've got a lot of large corporates, the Facebooks, the Apples, there's a long list that would love to see it become more pervasive, because it's another source of data that they can leverage for the very reason I just talked about. Why go map Market Street? Like, all 5 of those companies shouldn't go map Market Street in San Francisco if there's a really good one in OSM. And that's why I think you're seeing folks like Apple. I mean, they're one of the biggest contributors to OSM around the world now. And, yes, they're collecting data in certain parts of the world for major countries, but they're using, and they've said this very publicly, they're using OSM. And I think that's fantastic. The challenge gets to be that yin and yang between the corporate desire to use it commercially and to contribute to it, and the, shall we say, the volunteer part of that organization, the nonprofit part of it. For instance, they still won't allow bulk contributions of map fixes into it. So I think where this world goes is, I'd like to think, shall we say, common sense prevails. It's maybe my interpretation of common sense. But if we went back to that example we used before of, say, DoorDash, maybe working with you guys, collecting trip data and creating optimized routes. Okay, so that's going to be important for DoorDash to maintain and keep that data unique to them as a competitive advantage. But along the way, as they're doing that, they're picking up important information about the road network, maybe just that center line, and maybe they're comparing it to an OSM map because they can overlay those routes on an OSM map. But if along the way they can make improvements to that, say, hey, that center line's a little bit off, it's really over here, or some other data attributes along the way, and they can contribute that back to OSM, back to the community, that's a good thing. So everybody can leverage that, because that's not a unique benefit for DoorDash in that example. What's going to be unique for them is that optimized route. And so I think that happy medium of the ability to share and contribute for common data, but yet at the same time maintain the ability to carry and maintain unique data for a company, so they can create competitive advantage and will create an incentive for them to invest in OSM. I think that's where the world ends up over time.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies over the years have got burnt with trying to, what they thought were doing a good thing by contributing back tons of edits. So yeah, I think there's clearly that balance, right? But because people in the community think, hey, you know what, I'm going out there mapping things, I'm on ground, I understand this neighborhood the best, versus corporates are like, hey, you know what, I'm going to apply machine learning at large scale. So yeah, I guess it's a delicate balance, but yeah, hopefully sort of common sense prevails over time.
If I could just add one other thing. You are seeing some interesting things, and I want to give a shout out to Facebook in this regard. They just launched recently, I don't know if you saw this, Daylight, which is this service. Because one of the other concerns about OSM was vandalism, right? People were going into the map and labeling things incorrectly and being smartasses about it, and in some cases, quite cruel. So Facebook's gone in and, because they're using OSM, and they've gone in, they've cleaned up a lot of those areas and kind of applied some anti-vandalism, approaches to it. And now they're publishing that back out there, and you can go to daylight.org or what have you, and kind of leverage that kind of cleaned up data. And I think that's another good example where some of the corporates can contribute some valuable information, and without the overall OSM community feeling like it's trying to take over the whole thing, so to speak.
Yeah, and maybe it's a time to take a couple of questions here. So one question here is, I'm going to rephrase this question also a little bit. So the question here is, we talked about Apple, we talked about Google. Obviously, they're very consumer-centric maps. But what do you think is the difference between building for consumer-centric use cases versus, building APIs either to be sold, or let's say you're building APIs for other businesses, or just, instead of trying to build an API that the whole world needs, trying to build an API that works well for just your business and gives you, as you mentioned, uniqueness, competitive advantage. So what's your thought on, the difference or the challenges or benefits of, one approach versus the other? Or what are the different, thought process one should have for these two use cases?
Well, I think like anything in technology, it comes down to what's the use case you're trying to create, what's the benefit you're trying to create for whom. Okay, so in a consumer use case, if it's maps for simple driving directions, but also maybe shopping and some advertising. Hey, where do I find the pair of sneakers on sale? And leveraging that, which we do in every day. That's a particular kind of use case. and I don't think you need a whole lot of custom APIs for that kind of a thing. On the other hand, if you think about the B2B or the enterprise uses of mapping and routing, that get into very specific use cases that can help companies save money, save time, be more accurate in terms of finding what they're doing. It could be, for instance, I heard this example the other day, construction equipment companies that are driving around, very unmapped areas, but along the way, it's their territory, it's their property. They want to, if they can capture that data and start doing routing on that, that's unique to them. Nobody else really needs that, but they need that.
Makes sense.
But they don't have to create a whole routing algorithm themselves just to solve that one problem. So they're probably not going to do it. So if there is the ability for a company to come in and help create routing algorithms for them specifically for their use case, that's going to give them the business benefits that they need, but without needing to hire a whole geospatial team, because they're a construction company, they're not a mapping company. Okay, so that's what I get into. Leverage third-party software companies that know how to do this, that are focusing specifically in that area, and create the kind of unique either routes or the APIs to allow the customization of those routes for those kind of companies. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that. The bar always rises, and the more people realize what's possible, or they've seen their competitor doing something, they're going to want to do it. All right, and so they need help in doing it.
Yeah,
I remember you're not going to get it from a standard mapping company like a Google or an Apple or whatever, because their focus is more on the general consumer space.
Yeah, I remember when I joined Grab. This was 2017, and then we were just starting off our Maps team. And I remember the problem statement at the time partly was, okay, like we're using Google, we're competing with Uber, and what is it that Uber is doing differently that their experience just works so much better? And like it was literally this question that sent us down this rabbit hole to say, okay, what is it that they're doing differently, right? Like, so let us figure it out. Let us hire some people. Let's speak to some experts, and then you slowly realize, hey, you know what? There is so much you can get out of this in terms of customer experience, competitive advantage, and then taking Grab's example in the region. Other companies, I remember approaching us saying, hey, you're doing something cool, right? Like, and how is it that you're able to make this work? So I hear what you're saying about doing something that you care about, and that's in a way a very different problem to solve than trying to build something that 1 billion users on the planet are going to use. So for Kim, I think you've made a very compelling argument about, hey, you should really, if you depend quite a bit on location, you should consider doing at least some things yourself. Leverage vendors, wherever it's not, core to you, or core versus context, and some of the thought process on how you can draw the line. I know we've talked about, a bunch of, fairly serious-ish topics mixed in with some of your, amazing anecdotes and stories about Larry Page and Travis and whatnot. But maybe sort of moving to, slightly lighter topics. I know you invest in a ton of companies. You sit on a bunch of company boards, and you're very actively involved with helping startups. Would love to get your thoughts on, what are some of the most exciting companies you're seeing emerging in different areas of location technology?
Sure. I mean, and that's the kind of thing, I said, look, the mapping industry is small. It's getting bigger, but it's still relatively small. And it's fun to compare notes with some friends. And I did that with a few friends before this one, just to make sure I was somewhat current. But, there's always been something interesting going on in mapping. You think, hey, we're done. Well, no, you never seem to be done. But what the trend I'm seeing is that the startups that are coming out are not trying to do the whole thing. They're very, very specialized. And maybe it's best to think about them in terms of some categories. So, in that entire kind of value chain. So you're seeing stuff even right at the front end in terms of location technology itself. It's not mapping, but just how do I find people? Like how do we improve on GPS? Because, urban canyon problems and this kind of stuff. So there are companies that are focused in that space, the point ones, the Swift navigations, the geoflexes, et cetera. There are new data types coming up all the time, much more specialized data types. For years, people have been trying to do indoor mapping, shopping malls, airports, and that's still going on. There are companies like, Point Inside and Cardo and Mapstead doing that. Specialized data for, here's a more recent example, even sidewalk data. You think about what's going on in mobility with scooters now and robots. I'm helping a particular company, KiwiBot, that's one of the robot companies. They're engaged with cities now, running the robots around, not just to deliver food and meals, but actually to collect sidewalk data to figure out where and how the sidewalks need to be repaired and or mapped, because scooters and others are using them. So it's more important to have more accurate data there. One I want to give a quick shout out to is a company I've worked with for a lot of years down in South Africa. Where's My Transport? They've been collecting data for 8 years now to help improve public transportation in the developing world, because a lot of commuters travel 2 hours a day each way, and they use informal transportation, minibuses and whatnot, and it's just, there's no logical schedules to it, whatever. So they're focused on collecting the data, creating the routes, and creating schedules for that, and marrying it with formal transportation, and creating a much more think of it as like move it for the developing world, but creating a much better experience for the commuter in the developing world. So there's a lot going on there. Stuff in the POI space, places space has been happening for a while. The Web3 world, Web3 words, I should say, and SafeGraph and others. The one I guess I want to maybe finish up on is, and maybe I'm playing to the audience a little bit here, but the routing and customized routing. But look, Mapbox, I've known the folks. I've got a lot of friends at Mapbox for years. They started off in map tiling, didn't want to focus on anything other than that at first, but now they're trying to build the whole stack. But in the customized routing area, there's obviously you guys, there's RideOS, the routing company, again, focused in maybe particularly on public transportation. But the key is you're not focusing on the entire stack, tackling some really hard problems, and maybe using that example that we talked about before, is leveraging a customer's own data to create optimized routes. And I think that's a trend you're going to see just more and more of. You'll get more into that when we get into the autonomous space. There are companies focusing specifically on that. But we could probably talk about this forever. I don't want to take too much of the time, but it's a fun area. There's just a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, no, this is actually pretty good. And actually, I think you answered some of audience questions as well. There was actually a very specific question on mapping challenges and opportunities within sort of the autonomous delivery and the delivery bot space. I'm just going to mark this thing as answered. I know we're just almost out of time. So maybe we'll take a couple more questions and then we'll call it a day. Maybe let's take something on a very different note. So there's a question from Andre. So the question is, many countries are now trying to regulate data, meaning control on where the servers would be located, and who can access them, etc. So how do you think this impacts mapping services, a lot of whom are international, like Google, Mapbox, whatnot? And maybe do you see some kind of government level collaboration? And I'm going to add my own question along with it, which is, what kind of opportunities do you think it enables for newer companies to who could take advantage of this sort of nationalized approach to many areas of technology that's happening right now?
Like a nationalized approach? I mean, like, how could a government maybe?
Yeah, what I meant by that is, a lot of countries, instead of this globalization, they're now starting to sort of look inward and say, no, hey, I want to focus within my borders, so to say.
Yeah, I have a bit of an issue with that. I'd rather see this be. I'm much more in favor of open data. All around. I think where government can play a role in here is, okay, so what are the use cases? How are you trying to help your citizens? What is it you're trying to achieve with that? Yes, put a focus there first before you start thinking about helping the rest of the world. But much more public-private partnerships, I think, will emerge. and I'm seeing this. I'll give you one example is, we talked about collecting trip data. Okay. Well, cities, city planners, you'd think with all the people they have in government, that they have a lot of people in planning. The reality is they don't have a lot of good data. So one of the things we did at Uber, for instance, there was a thing we created where we experimented this in Seattle, where all the trip data that we collected, we contributed that back to, in this case, Seattle, so that they could then use that to think about, okay, where are we seeing traffic tie-ups? How to help us plan for where we should put stoplights or street lights and that kind of stuff, or stop signs, and help them improve traffic flow. So I think that kind of a public-private collaboration is, I'm kind of leveraging the question going in that area, or how to help improve public transportation and help that complete end-to-end solution. Because the reality is a lot of people don't just take one mode of transportation to get to work. They might drive to a train station, then get on a train, go into the city, and then take an Uber from there or what have you. So how do you improve that collaboration between them? I know at Uber, we started working with cities like Denver and Dallas, so that you could actually book a ride on the subway system or on the bus using the Uber app. I think you're going to see more of that merging of data to help the consumer with more of a complete end-to-end solution, so they can make important decisions on what's the most optimum way based on time and cost for me to get from point A to point B. I think you're going to see a lot more of that.
Yeah, I remember when, in some of my previous jobs, actually both at Ola and at Grab, working with the government was like a lot of governments, even if they would not admit it publicly, would come to sort of these companies in private and say, hey, you know what, like, I think you guys have a much better sense of how my city operates, and you can give me much more insights. So in private, that's what they would come and they'll say, hey, can you give us data on this? Can you give us data on that? And then even if the public narrative was not that. I know we're just out of time. I'm just going to take one last question. So there are quite a few questions on, a topic that was obviously, super hyped topic for a long period of time, but the hype has sort of now died down, which is, autonomous vehicles. So yeah, one of the questions here, for example, is, as autonomous vehicles become a norm, do you think maps or the place of maps in society almost becomes like a public utility, where it is like, you expect it to be on like 99.99% of the time. So yeah, and just in general, what's your thought on, because obviously Uber also invested a fair bit, obviously now it's divested its ATG portfolio, but yeah, I would love your thoughts in general on maps and, I guess, autonomous space.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing about Uber was it was important. The reason we invested in autonomous cars, by the way, was not because we wanted to be an autonomous car company. It was because there were two drivers. One was for it, no pun intended, but it was, making sure that we could get enough drivers. If we ran out of drivers, then maybe autonomous cars could help with that. But also existential threat of, if other companies that were building autonomous cars, maybe like a Google or somebody, created one. Once those are out there, you can launch a ride-hailing service, cut 75% of the cost out by not having a driver, and then drop prices. So there was threat. So the important thing for Uber was not to necessarily be first, but just to be tied for first, or at least have access to it from a supply point of view. And I think that's why they've made that shift in terms of they've outsourced it now, but they're still interested in having it on. I think, look, the whole thing about the map, excuse me, for autonomy is obviously it needs to be incredibly precise. You're going to get back into that same problem of how many companies are going to go and map Market Street to make it even more, an HD map, a 3D map for their autonomous. I mean, it's kind of silly. It's kind of crazy that everybody's going to repeat the same efforts all over again. So I think there will be some. Well, I guess the other thing to think about in that is autonomous cars can't just rely on just the map. It's all about sensors. And some people would argue you don't even need a map. It's all about real-time sensors and kind of like mapping as you go. So it's going to be a variation on that. You need a base map of a high definition 3D map to start with, but it's all going to be sensors. As to whether it becomes a public utility, that's a stretch. I do think though longer term. The roads themselves will get much smarter. They'll provide much more data. Cars will be connected, so that you'll know about weather in front of it, and speed and all that kind of stuff. And that kind of data will be shared. And I think the government will get involved in trying to assist on a little bit on that.
Great. I know, Kim, there are tons more questions, but we're out of time. So yeah, so firstly, thank you, everyone. And maybe, Kim, from your side, any closing remarks for companies? I think we talked about a bunch of topics, but anything to close things out, or just like one takeaway for people to keep in mind as they go home and sort of sleep over it. I'm sure you've given everyone plenty of food for thought.
Well, I mean, I think we've covered most of it. I guess the key thing, what's fun for me to see, and I've only been in it 15 years or so, but it just keeps changing, and it changes all the time. And that's the fun part about it, because expectations rise. The bar always rise. I mean, hell, it was cool before when you could just print out a map with directions on a piece of paper that gave you better driving directions. And then even just to get routing on a mobile phone. And I realize I'm sounding like the old man that I am, but the point is that expectations rise so much now that people get pissed off if somebody takes me down a route that's 4 minutes slower than another route. It's kind of like, and they expect real-time data, like, okay, there's a traffic accident, there's a road closure, there's construction going on in this. Well, you got to get all that data and put that in to create obviously the most optimized route, because whether it's a consumer or whether it's a business where that means time and money, it's important to get the best, because in particular, in the latter case, businesses want to gain differentiation. They want to be able to have unique advantages against their own competitors. And I think increasingly they'll use mapping as a general term, but the routing and everything that goes around with it for that. So to me, it just means there's more and more business opportunities in this space, and that's what's really exciting. I'm really psyched about all the companies that are coming to market, you guys included. So I'll finish by saying I appreciate the invitation. I'm really impressed with the stuff you guys are working on. I think it's very cool. I want to wish you guys good luck, and thanks for having me.
And thank you so much, Kim, for making time. I know it's early in the morning there. And thank you so much, everyone in the audience who joined, and for all your questions. I know we couldn't answer all of them, but yeah, hopefully, you got a fair few actionable, things out of it, or at the very least, a new way of thinking about your roadmap ahead. So thank you, everyone, and see you on the next Spatial Insider webinar series. Yeah, bye-bye.